Welcome back to the Matter of Facts podcast on the Prepper Broadcasting Network. We talk prepping, guns, and politics every week on iTunes, Stitcher, and Spotify. Go check out our content at mwfpodcast.com on Facebook or Instagram. You can support us via Patreon or by checking out our affiliate partners. I'm your host, Phil Rabley, and my co-host, Andrew Bobo, is on the other side of the mic, and here's your show.
Welcome back to Matter of Facts podcast. It is like eyeball bleeding early on a Sunday morning. Slightly less early on a Sunday morning for Andrew. Miracles of time zones. But, oh yes. Which is a weird experience because, like, I'm speaking to people kind of in the future because this isn't going to hit the podcast feed for like 5 days. So by then, the world could have completely changed. But at this moment in the morning, we had a topic to talk about, and that is the miracles of coffee. Now, see, here's the thing, because Andrew and I, we've discussed this, so we've decided we're going to branch out on the content of the Matter of Facts podcast just a little bit. And I've always felt like there are certain things that are kind of like prepper adjacent as far as hobbies. Like, there's a reason why I'm a big proponent of taking your family out camping, because it gives you a chance to learn about skills, it gives you a chance to try out skills, it gives you a chance to use gear that you don't normally use in your suburban life. And those things come in handy when bad things start happening. You know, like part of the reason why my family was able to weather Hurricane Ida to the degree we were is because we do have a lot of camping gear. We do spend a lot of time outside of our home, unplugged from the power grid and the water, the water grid and everything else, and we were able to kind of roll with the punches. But it's acknowledging that a hobby can help prepare your family for hardship, and then investing into that hobby and enjoying it as a hobby with the understanding that there's an ulterior motive. And coffee for me is a daily drink, but for a couple of years now, I've been advocating that people heavily consider storing green coffee beans along with the rest of their preps. If you're a coffee drinker, like my wife's not a coffee drinker, I've got a whole bunch of tea bags for her. But if you drink coffee, I've always advocated green coffee beans because there's no debating the fact that coffee beans, or coffee as a general rule, doesn't last for very long, especially in unair conditioned space, once it's already roasted ground. Can we agree on that at least?
Yeah, I mean, well, anything in the green form will last longer, really, especially if you preserve it a little bit better. I mean, look at just grain and stuff like that. Like, you can preserve grain in a certain, if you have and then if you have the grinder and all that stuff, that you can make, all kinds of stuff with it. So, but yeah, green coffee beans. I know I got a bag that I need to start playing with too. But yeah, I started going down this rabbit hole probably about a year ago because I remember you and I talking about it, and I started researching it. I didn't research it. I haven't researched it nearly as heavy as you have, but definitely, it's interesting. You can definitely, and like what you said before the show, it's kind of like reloading. Like, if you enjoy shooting and you get into reloading, it's just you have more bullets and you actually get more. You get down to the science of everything more, and you can actually fine tune those loads to shoot way more accurate with a rifle that you have, which is a good thing. Just like, and then that goes right into coffee. You get the green beans, and you learn, okay, at this temperature for this long, at this much agitation and this time, I can brew the cup of coffee that I like, and it's just a science. It just comes down to it, and it's fun.
Mm-hmm. I do kind of kick rocks slightly at the idea that coffee roasting is a science, because it can be. Like, and like I told Andrew, like I have this weird personality where once I get interested in something, I go full blown into it till I learn as much about it as I set out to, and like. There is a ton of science involved in coffee roasting. There's a ton of science involved in coffee brewing. There's a lot of science involved. However, the end result of all this is that it all comes down to how does the coffee taste, which is purely subjective. So it's this weird situation where you could track every variable, you could work as hard as possible to reproduce it, you could do all those things, and the end result not be exactly what you were expecting. There's a bit of art mixed in with the science of coffee, which makes it confounding and more interesting, in my opinion. But I did kind of want to talk about it because it's a cool hobby to get into, as far as like not just roasting coffee, which is something admittedly I know a bit about, but I really wish I had somebody on hand that was like knew more about home roasting than I do to bring into the conversation. I don't. If you're out there, I'm curious. I'd love to meet you and to pick your brain. But in the meantime, I want to talk about coffee roasting. I want to talk about how to go from green bean to this stuff in as many different ways as I feel like the audience might be interested to hear. Because again, if we're talking about storing green coffee beans, whether it's because you're just a coffee nerd like I am, or a prepper, or both, then you need to know how to convert it from green beans into coffee. Because let's start with the raw product. A green coffee bean is... I actually think... Do I have... No, the one slide I don't have prepared is green coffee beans. There's a bag back there on the shelf of green coffee beans from Disaster Coffee called Bunker Beans. And they are a little hard, dense green bean. If you want to get like really technical, and I'm not super well versed in it, but the actual coffee plant produces these little cherries, and each one of these cherries has 2 of those beans in it. The process of getting those beans out and to your doorstep is its own episode that I'm not super well versed in. But suffice to say, you get a little dense green coffee bean. If you put that little green dense coffee bean into your grinder, you might, if it's a cheaper grinder, you might break it. If it's a more expensive grinder, you're going to get very uneven, crappy grinds. And if you try to brew coffee with those green grinds, you're going to experience some impressive intestinal discomfort. Let's say that. I've heard that the specific mechanism is because there's mycotoxins present in unroasted green coffee beans. I only saw that from one source, so I don't know that I fully trust it, but it is well known that if you attempt to turn green coffee beans into drinkable coffee, you're going to have a problem. Substantial problem. A lot of discomfort. But we take coffee beans, we roast them to chemically convert them to something that we can actually grind. Then we grind them up, then we brew coffee, and we convert this innocuous little green bean into something drinkable. But getting from point A to point B is a thing. And I think probably the most appropriate place to start this conversation is with storage. Because again, like this is something that I store in my preps. I've got 15 pounds of green coffee beans in my prepper storage. And like I was telling Andrew, like this kind of merits its own discussion, because when we talk about storing like rice or dried beans or any of that kind of stuff, the mechanisms for storing all of that for long-term storage are kind of well known. It's well adhered to. You could use airtight buckets or Mylar bags. There's ways out there. I like oxygen absorbers and desk impacts. Get as much of the humidity and the oxygen out of the buckets, seal them up, and you're pretty much done. I mean, dried rice, dried beans will store just fine for years on end with no hurt. The problem is green coffee beans are not exactly as homogeneous as a grain of rice or another kind of bean would be. It has carbon dioxide embedded into it, which is an interesting commodity. That's actually one of the reasons that green beans tend to keep longer than roasted beans, because one of the things that happens when you're roasting a green coffee bean is that the carbon dioxide pops out of the bean. You follow me?
Yeah.
So as long as that carbon dioxide is inside that bean, oxygen can't infiltrate inside of it. That's one of the reasons it lasts longer. But the other thing is that there's oils inside the bean, and some of those come out during the roasting process. So it's kind of a mixed bag. You have a non-homogeneous bean, excuse me, and I've heard from some sources they expect a 10-year shelf life storage. in an airtight environment, in an oxygen-free environment, so on and so forth. I've heard 10-year storage. I've heard other people say 12 months.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's one of those situations where when my beans get that old, I'll bruise them up and I'll let you know what it ends up being. But in the meantime, I drink enough coffee, regularly enough, that I might end up opening up that bucket and just like not using an oxygen absorber. And what I might wind up doing is every so many months, I'll order 5 or 10 more pounds of beans, pull those beans out, and just rotate through it. In other words, take it from a storage posture of 3 to 5 years and convert it into more like my pantry extension, where I have stuff in the pantry extension that's like my can rack and things that I don't try to store for 2, 3, or 4 years because I'm constantly going through it. It's constantly being rotated. And it might be a better solution to do that with green beans, but if anybody knows 100% for certain, I'm all ears. I just know I've heard very different numbers from different sources that all seem fairly reliable. So it makes me wonder if part of what's going on here is like the ultimate test of coffee is a subjective taste test. Is one person tasting something the other person isn't, and that's why the opinion's different.
Right, and I mean, and going off of that, just what I've found and stuff too is, and it's gonna vary. Like I found the 12-month thing, but that's just storing in a location that is, cool, dry, that doesn't have a lot of light. They said as you start, if you add light, actually, the more light that you have hitting the coffee beans, that can actually start affecting the taste faster. But like what we talked about before the show, I bet you if you took, I'd be kind of curious to take like the bag of bunker beans that I have. I'd be kind of curious to take that, separate it out into different smaller packages, and then vacuum seal it. Throw in a couple oxygen absorbers inside of that package, vacuum seal it, and then put it in a bucket. And I'm kind of curious to see, and that'd be interesting to do, is like mark them as the date, and then in 5 months pull a bag out and see how it tastes. In 10 months pull a bag out, see how it tastes. You know what I mean? Like separate those out, and then kind of do your own experiment. That'd be kind of like over a year or two. That'd be kind of interesting to see. And then if you document it and stuff, I mean, it'd be a kind of a long experiment to do, but I think it might be interesting.
Yeah, and part of the tricky part of this is that it's also going to somewhat hinge upon your palate. Like, is your taste palate developed enough to taste those minute differences? Because they might be minute.
Right.
It's one of those things where if 5 months causes this dramatic shift in the way the coffee tastes, then long-term storage coffee beans is just not possible. Like everything we've ever heard is not right if that's the case. So I don't know that. Like with most food storage things, though, I don't think we're going to see a massive shift over 5 or 6 months. I think more likely we're going to see a slow progressive shift over years. So then the question is going to become, where's the break-even point? Is it 3 years? Is it 3.5? Is it 4?
And that's what I'm saying, though, is like, so you break it up to where, say, every 6 months, and your palate might not catch the minute changes between 6 months to a year, but after a year, you could, if you start tasting a massive difference, that's when you're like, okay, 1.5 years is my cutoff. Like I need to make sure I rotate my coffee out after 1.5 years or something like that. And then after 1.5 years, if crap hits the fan, I guess I'm going to be a raging a-hole because I'm not going to have any coffee. But no, I mean, it's just interesting. Just the theory behind the coffee. I mean, people have been doing coffee for years, and I mean, long time. So there's got to be there's something to it, especially storage. So I mean, especially when you get like some of these coffee makers that they get the specialty, they get the beans from different parts of the world. By the time they get by the time they harvest the bean and they package it up and ship it and everything like that, I mean, I'm sure you're well within probably a good month or so, if not longer. Mm-hmm. And so it stores at least that long. But it's just interesting, the coffee, because like I was saying, the one of the military books I was reading, the guy was talking about, uh, and this just goes to show you, because it does take a long time, especially if you like just to go from whole bean to brewing it. I mean, it takes you a while, because especially if you hand grind it, if you're camping and you hand grind, then you're making, depending on excuse me, depending on how much coffee you're making, and everything. And then if you add brewing into it, or roasting rather, I mean, that takes even longer. But this book I was listening to, the guy talks about how, when he was overseas in Afghanistan, like, people would actually bring homebrew kits that would make Starbucks blush. And that's a quote from his book. And he basically said it would take him an hour to brew one cup of coffee. They'd sit there and they'd roast the beans. They would sit there and they'd hand grind everything, and then they would get the water to a certain temp, and then they would pour it just slowly over top of the grounds, the filter and everything. And then he said they'd sit there and they would enjoy their coffee. And it was, one part of it was their way of dealing with what was going on overseas, and kind of like taking their mind off of it, and as a hobby. But I mean, honestly, it's just like reloading, just really with like anything. If you're doing it, if you enjoy doing that, you're just like, I mean, I look at it as almost like hunting. Like, when I go out in the woods, I see a deer, I shoot deer. You go home, you skin the deer, and I've shot a deer, skinned it, grabbed a roast out of the hind end, and roasted it that night. And like, you go from field to table within a few hours. And like, being able to see that process it's humbling. It's actually, I love seeing that process. And just like beans, just like coffee, you see this process of, okay, you didn't grow it and all that stuff, which would be interesting to get into down the road. But but being able to take this green product and then transform it to, hey, now I'm sitting here and drinking it. Yeah, it might have took me an hour to do, but it makes you enjoy it more, is the way I see it.
Yeah, it definitely makes you more invested in it, in my opinion. Like, I mean, we'll get into that here just a little bit, but like, just the whole process of converting green bean into drinkable coffee is it's interesting. It does make you a little bit more invested in it. But I did want to lay one more thing at the feet of, before we move on from storage. The other thing that we're all going to run up against when we're trying to do this taste testing, as far as like, I stored the beans this long, what does it taste like? The other problem we're going to run into is roasting. Because in my brief experience, roasting coffee has almost more impact on the taste of the coffee than probably the age of the beans does, in my opinion. Because, I mean, I've started from the same 5-pound bag of bunker beans, and I have made some dramatically different tasting coffee. Like, everything from like, okay, now, and part of this also bears conversation. Like, my personal preference for coffee is like upper ends of medium to a dark roast. I like things that are like really bold and smoky, and I don't do light roast coffee. I have drank it before. I will drink it. But it's not my preference. So when you're roasting a green coffee bean, understand that roast level, that degree of processing that bean through heat, is totally within your control, and you can turn the exact same batch of green coffee beans into anything from a super light breakfast blend, which some people refer to as being floral. I don't taste anything floral in coffee ever, but I do taste a very definite difference in a light roast and a dark roast. And me having roasted several batches of bunker beans now to work within that one kind of bag, that one origin, that one blend of beans, and start to figure out what the roasting does to the taste of the bean, I've gone everywhere from like really roasty, smoky flavors in a dark roast, which I think maybe the next slide. Actually, no, I don't. One of these slides, I think I have a picture of the roast I did just the other day. It's dark. It's very dark. It's going to be some really good French roast. But I've gone everywhere from there down to like, I mean, stuff that was just barely in the first crack, which I'll explain in a second. And it was like a really light breakfast blend. It had almost a taste of peanuts, if that makes sense. Like, it was almost a grassy taste. Because that how far you roast that bean dramatically changes the taste. And that's the other problem you're going to run up against if you try to do an experiment. Say, well, every 6 months I'm going to roast these beans, see what the flavor tastes like. If you can't figure out how to get your roast super consistent, you're going to conflate the taste of the roast with the taste of the beans. And I don't have good advice for anybody about that, except you're going to have to roast a lot of coffee to get good at it. So you can develop a degree of consistency, and you can figure out what your tongue prefers, and you can roast to that. Now, on one side of the screen, I have a obviously very small hand roasting pan. It roasts about 3 ounces of beans at a time. This is what I keep in my camping gear. So, like, anytime we have a campfire or anytime, I mean, I've even waved this thing over my, I've waved this over my little MSR pocket rocket. I've waved this over my, my Coleman 2-burner gas stove before, over a campfire, whatever. You could use this with my solo stove. It'd work perfect. But this is my little hand roasting pan, and this is what would be considered a hot air roaster, because it's the hot air of the fire coming up through the metal grate, and it's directly heating your beans. It'll do about 3 ounces at a time. That's like 3 ounces of beans is enough to charge either. It'll charge my percolator, my camp percolator, which is kind of a larger perk. It is enough to charge my French press twice. So, like, I can make a batch of beans, I can grind half of them, I can have morning coffee, and then have an afternoon pot, all out of this one little pan. It gets the job done. I have found that with this, it initially was deceivingly simple to use. I am realizing now it's a little tricky to use, because with a hot air roaster, you don't have anything in the roasting process in the pan acting as a heat sink. So, like, if you come away from the fire too aggressively, the temperature just plummets and the roast stalls, and that introduces some really nasty taste in your coffee. And if you get too close to the fire, the bean temperature goes to the ceiling, they catch fire, they burn. So it's like, you know, it's just one of those things where, like, you don't have, with hot air roasting, especially a little pan like this over fire, you have no buffer whatsoever. You have to make really... I wouldn't say it's difficult, but you have to make, like, very concerted changes as far as how close to the fire you get. You can't make rapid changes. You have to just, you know, move in and then move out, pay really close attention to what the beans are doing. If you see smoke, you probably need to back up just a little bit. But you can't make huge... It's kind of like driving a car, and you first learn how to drive, and every time you touch the brake pedal, you slam it to the floor and send your face into the windshield. You have to, like, develop a gentle touch. Just get a little closer, a little further away, pay attention to what you're doing, set up a feedback loop, but that will roast coffee. That's how I started. On the right is the roaster I just got yesterday, and it's a popcorn popper, guys, but it works beautifully. So with that, I set it on a burner. I have a infrared thermometer that I use to monitor the heat of the bottom of the pot, because unlike the hot air roaster, now I'm dealing with what's called a convection roaster. In other words, the bean being in contact with the bottom of the pot, that's where the heat transfer is taking place. And that stainless steel pot acts as a bit of a heat sink, which I'll talk about in just a minute. I might have annihilated my first set of beans out of it, but I'm not sure yet. I have to roast some and try it. But I'm waiting for them to off gas. But, so... in that way, you have to kind of preheat your pot to get it up to roasting temperature. You have to drop your beans in. There's a little agitator in the bottom to constantly move the beans, which I found produces a much more consistent roast. I get a much more consistent color over the whole batch of beans versus the hand roaster, where I get some darker, some lighter, and it was a little hard to get it was a little more difficult to get a really consistent batch of beans out of it. The stovetop roaster on initial use seems to be working more consistently, and I'm sure once I kind of beat the learning curve, I'll get really good use out of this. I've also tried roasting beans in a cast iron pan, which I know people who do it and are very successful with it. I suck at it, so I don't know what to tell anybody who wants to try it, except do your research and try it and let me know how it works. For me, it did not work well. Andrew, you talked about wanting to do it in an air fryer earlier.
Yeah, well, I was just looking online, different ways of doing it. I mean, and there's a ton of different ways, but yeah, one of the things that popped up was doing it in an air fryer
Yeah.
or in an oven. I mean, in general.
And the thing about roasting coffee beans is that you need temperature. Obviously, you need some kind of temperature control. How much really depends on like how finicky you want to be about your roasting. Like you talk to, especially your professional roasters, and they're using thermocouples and mapping software to check to like plot temperature over time, and they're looking for a very specific curve and stuff. But they're trying to mass produce like tons upon tons of coffee beans at exactly the same roast. So they kind of have to watch it that closely. For us being home roasters, if you want to go to that extreme, go for it. I never will. It's just there becomes a certain point where like there's a certain amount of work where when you have to go to that limit, it's not fun anymore, to me at least. Like I don't mind my roast being a little bit inconsistent from one to the next. It doesn't hurt my feelings that bad. But the problem you're going to have with the good thing about an air fryer or an oven is you get active temperature control. Like you set your temperature on the little dial and it holds that, and that's useful. The problems you're going to have are twofold. A is a lack of agitation, because I don't have to tell you that you sticking your arm into a 400-degree oven to agitate your beans is going to be a little bit of a problem. And the problem is if the beans sit like on a pan or on a tray for even like 30 seconds without being agitated, they're going to start to scorch. Like you're roasting at 380 to 420 degrees. Beans are just not going to survive very long at that temperature without being constantly agitated. That's why I resort to the methods that I'm using, because I can constantly move the beans while they're being roasted. And I think that's important. The other problem you're going to run into is that at certain points in the process of roasting these beans, part of the process is endothermic, meaning the beans are absorbing heat. And then part of the process is exothermic, where there's a sudden release of energy from the beans, and part of that comes out as heat. So it's not just that you need a way to control the heat, but you need a way to vary it, and you need a way to monitor it. Like in my little hand roasting pan, I monitor it all through my ears and through my sight. I can see the beans smoking. Obviously, we're too hot. I can listen to the beans when they get into first crack. And I probably need to explain that term here in a second, because I'm going to use it a few times. But I'm hearing first crack. First crack sounds really aggressive. I need to back off just a little bit. I'm too hot. And it's the sight and the sound of roasting that guides me. You lose all that when you put it into a closed container. So one of those things where it's like you either have to be able to observe the beans while they're roasting, or you need data-driven elements so that you can tell what's going on with them. But you can't put them into... If you put them into a magic box, like some of these purpose-built coffee roasters, you're depending on the magic box to do the work. Some of them were really good at doing the work, but things that were not purpose-built to roast coffee beans are not good magic boxes to put coffee beans into and hope for the best, in my opinion. Now, I've used this term first crack, second crack a few times. Have you heard this before?
Yeah, I've heard a little bit, but I'm not really sure what it is.
Okay, so when you start to roast a coffee bean, you start with a green bean, and then it'll turn yellow, and then it'll turn about a burnt orange, and then right about the time it starts to turn into brown, you'll start hearing this cracking noise, and it almost sounds like somebody snapping their fingers. That is the sound, because you remember how we started this conversation off by saying that coffee beans are not homogeneous. There's carbon dioxide embedded in the bean. That is the sound of the carbon dioxide and any moisture in the bean, and that's another thing that comes out. But it becomes so agitated and so heated up that it actually cracks the bean open and escapes. And that is the sound you're hearing. Once your beans have reached first crack, they are technically drinkable. It will be I've done it before. It is the lightest light roast you've ever had in your life. I don't care for it. Somebody else out there might really love getting beans at first crack, and it's like this super light roast. To me, it doesn't have a lot of flavor, but like I had heart palpitations afterwards. It was incredibly caffeinated. Well, but and this is one of the trade-offs this is one of the trade-offs with roasting coffee, is that the more you roast, you actually lose caffeine. So your darkest roast that has the kind of the most aggressive flavors actually has less caffeine and less acid to it. And your lightest roasts have more caffeine, more of an acidic, astringent taste to them. But you also get a lot of you get more. I don't want to use the word you get more flavor, because it's not that you get more flavor. If you roast, the more you roast coffee beans, the more you're tasting the roast. Mm-hmm. The less you roast the coffee bean, the more you're tasting the origin of the bean, if that makes sense. Think of it like smoking a piece of meat. If you eat it like bleeding and moving, you're tasting the meat. If you smoke the hell out of it, you're tasting the smoke. Mm-hmm. You're still tasting the meat, but you're tasting the smoke too. Same thing with roasting. Did you have a question? I saw you.
No, I was itching my head.
Okay, but so that's kind of the trade-off there. If you stop your roast at first crack, you're going to have a roast that is very less smoky, less bold. The way my taste buds work, I don't like that, because it ends up being a very, like, I can brew it up extremely strong, and it still doesn't taste like much to me. Other people really like that. It's just personal preference kind of thing. But, oh, I was wrong. My next slide, I actually do have a picture of like 4 different levels of roasting, including the one I did yesterday, which is kind of what I go for. Which is going to look like charcoal to some people, but that's my thing. But, so that's kind of the thing of it, is if you stop, and not at the very, very beginning of first crack, because first crack kind of sounds like popping popcorn, where like you're going to hear 1s and 2s popping. And then when popcorn really gets going, it sounds like Baghdad. And first crack kind of works like that. Like, you'll hear 1 and 2s, and then after a while, the popping will get more insistent, more aggressive. Once that starts, you are firmly in first crack. You can stop there. You can take your beans out. You can rapidly cool them, because when you first take beans away from the heat, the internal temperature of the bean is still roasting it. So it's recommended to pour them into either a pair of colanders and kind of scoop them back and forth, or put them onto a flat. I usually just dump mine out onto a baking sheet. Single layer, cold air gets to them, and they cool down really, really fast. Like within a couple of minutes, they're down to 100 to 120 degrees. But bear in mind that we're roasting at about 400, so the temperature loss is fairly rapid. But if your beans are like piled up in a bowl or something, the very bottom are going to continue to roast for a while, which is why you want to cool them down quickly. Once you roast past first crack, depending on how enthusiastic I was being with the roasting, there have been times where I went straight from first crack straight into second crack, and it never stopped. And that was a little too aggressive. Technically correct roasting technique, you really should have a lull between first and second crack, where first crack ends and then second crack starts to pick up. Second crack will be less of a snapping noise and more of like a gentle popping noise, kind of like Rice Krispie treats when you pour them into milk. But it'll be a little quieter, it'll be a little less of a sharp sound. But there should be a lull between the two, and if you don't ever hear a lull between the two, you just go straight from first crack straight to black ass beans. Your temperature was too high and you went too fast. You really need to like come down on the temperature a little bit, agitate more, try to stretch out that period where your beans are roasting without burning. If you see a bit of smoke, that's normal when you get into second crack. If you see a lot of smoke or a fire, your temperature is entirely too high. You can either agitate more or lower temperature, or both. And this is where like the science departs from the art, because there is a certain amount of, there's a lot of science in reproducing a roast, where you roast it perfectly one time, you record all your data, you want to do that exact same profile every single time. That's all science. Roasting the perfect batch of beans one time is pure art, in my opinion. It is, I'm going to fool with it, I'm going to play with it, I'm going to vary this, I'm going to vary that, and I'm going to see what the end result is. And then once you get the final batch and you say, this is perfect, now it's about reproducing that. And that's purely a scientific endeavor. It's drop my beans in at this temperature, have my gas setting at this amount, First crack should be about this long, then it should lull. It should lull for about this long before second crack starts. I roast this far into first or second crack and I shut it off. I cool my beans this way. That's all the science involved in reproducing it. But the art form is how to get there the first time. Now, this is a little bit of an experiment I did. I started last weekend. I finished it up during the week. This actually goes with an article I wrote on mofpodcast.com that I should be releasing shortly, maybe today. But from left to right, that picture at the top is beans that were taken out at first crack. The middle picture is beans taken out in the lull between first and second crack. And the beans on the right were just at the very, very beginning of second crack. Can you tell the difference?
Mm-hmm.
Very slight though, right? Like it's not a real pronounced difference. That picture in the bottom right is beans that are ground that are roasted about as dark as I usually do, which is like almost finished with second crack, almost at the point of burning the beans. They're black and oily. But that's kind of my go-to. Now, that picture at the top, left to right, is those same 3 cups of coffee that's been ground. And now you can see definitely a more pronounced change in the color of the grinds now that it's been ground up. And those 3 pictures at the bottom is the same 3 cups that have been turned into coffee at the exact same ratio. And they looked exactly alike. Little difference in the amount of like the head or the foam or the crust that formed on the top of them, but ostensibly looked pretty much the same. So in this discussion about like roasting coffee, you have to understand that like the way you roast it, the method you use to roast it, I don't think it's going to have a huge impact on the taste. The degree to which you roast it will have an enormous impact on how the coffee tastes, and you're going to have to invest some time and effort into learning to roast so that you can figure out what you like to taste and you can figure out how to make that happen. And the best way to do that is buy a bag of beans and just play with it. I mean, you're going to drink a couple of skunked batches of coffee, but eventually you figure out what you're doing and the taste is amazing.
Yeah, that's where the single serve, so you don't have to brew a whole pot or something. That's where like the single serve, the Keurig, like my coffee maker downstairs, it's basically a Keurig machine, but it'll grind. So it'll grind and then it'll fill just enough for just basically 1 cup of coffee. Or you hand grind. That's the best thing to do is get a hand grinder and then just kind of experiment with that. But especially when you're just trying to figure out what you're doing and stuff. But yeah, it's the same one that I had. I got to buy a new one. Mine broke.
Really, your burrs broke?
No, the burrs didn't break. The glue that they have that holds the inner cylinder to the outer shell, that broke. It came up like the glue separated.
Oh, you mean this?
No. No, no, it's the grinder, like inside the
I'm following you now.
Yeah, the top part separated, so I need to buy me a new one. But no, it's interesting, especially if you like your coffee and you're camping, and it's just we all like to sit around the fire and just kind of we end up just staring at the fire in a way. I don't know what it is about it, but when you're camping and you're trying to find something to do, it's one of those things where it's like, well, have some coffee that you can sit around and you can play with a little bit and experiment with, especially if, and I mean, this goes all into prepping, because what good, you have all this coffee, say you have all this coffee that's already all pre-roasted and everything, you have it all stocked up, that's only going to last so long. And then it's, there's ways to preserve it, but there's some people that say, hey, let's freeze it and it'll work just fine. And there's some people that say you don't freeze it, it'll ruin it. But having the ability to take something from the green form, like green coffee beans, and get it all the way to the final form of drinking it, to me, that it only makes sense in a preparedness world to do it.
Well, before we move on to grinding, which is like a really short conversation, and then roasting, or not roasting, brewing. Let me just stress freezing coffee. If you're freezing ground coffee, stop. Freezing ground coffee. I've seen independent testing that has shown it does no freaking good as far as maintaining freshness. Freezing roasted whole beans can extend their shelf life some. But if we're talking about, like, if you follow down this rabbit hole and you are going to roast your own green coffee beans and grind them and brew them, there's no justification for freezing roasted beans, because you should be roasting the amount of beans that you're going to utilize within 1 to 2 weeks. And, you know, like, I store my roasted beans, actually, I have two methods of storing them. One is I have old repurposed coffee cans, which are not necessarily airtight, and they're not supposed to be. Because when you first roast a batch of coffee, it is going to continue to off-gas CO2 for a period of time. Like, you get most of your off-gas that first 24 hours afterwards, and then it continues to off-gas a little bit for several days after that. So I don't immediately store my beans in airtight containers. I put them into a coffee container. I'll actually leave the lid just kind of like sitting askew so that air can pass in and out, and let all that CO2 off-gas that first day. And then I seal the can, and I'll let it sit on the counter for a minute. And then I have another container which is more airtight, and that is what I keep my beans in, that are like dechaffed. That's another thing to discuss very briefly. But they're dechaffed, they're degassed, they're ready to be ground. And that sits right next to my grinder. Now, one of the things that comes off coffee beans when you roast them is little bits of like the very outer layer. It's referred to as chaff. Depending on your method of roasting, you will either get a ton of chaff flying off the beans while they're roasting, which is fine if you're roasting outdoors, sucks if you're roasting indoors, or you're going to end up with a lot of chaff you have to get off one way or the other. Like my hand pan, that knocks the chaff off the beans just perfectly all by itself. My stovetop popper doesn't. So I'm going to have to go through an extra step of taking the beans, putting them into a colander, and getting the chaff off of them before I store them. But all that being said, so you've roasted your beans, you've stored them. I recommend, and most people recommend, 8 to 24 hours to let them off-gas. If they off-gas for another day or two, it doesn't hurt anything. Roasted, unground coffee beans are okay in a sealed container for a few weeks from what I've seen and what I've researched. Ground coffee lasts, less than a quarter of the amount of time before it goes stale. So if you roast it, leave it roasted whole bean until you're ready to use it. Grind it on command and immediately brew it. And now all the discussions about should I freeze my coffee go out the window, because the roasted coffee will last just fine sitting on your counter in a sealed container for a week. And if you roast a batch that's enough for a week, or maybe a week and a day, week and 2 days to have a little bit of excess, you should not be in a situation where you need to freeze your beans. Also, if you freeze beans, if you do that, make sure they come back to room temperature before you grind them, because the bean being frozen will dramatically influence the way it grinds. Now, grinding coffee is a thing. Obviously, I've got a hand grinder. Andrew has a broken hand grinder. A lot of people have hand grinders. I recommend, if you're going to hand grind your coffee at home, you get a more of a quality grinder than what I have back here, because this is really just a cheap one to kind of keep in the camping gear. There's a lot of hand grinders out there, and if all you're doing is grinding for like coffee and not espresso, they're fairly affordable. There's a lot of good options out there. I also have an electric tabletop power grinder, which kind of the trade-off with power grinders is you're going to spend more money to get the same level of quality in the burrs and everything else and the consistency because of the motor. But having spent a lot of time grinding coffee by hand, it takes time and it wears you the hell out. So for convenience's sake, a power grinder at the home and then a hand grinder in your preps or your camping gear makes a certain amount of sense. start doing research into your preferred method of brewing coffee, because one thing that surprised me was that pre-ground coffee is ground kind of like the Goldilocks grind profile for multiple brewing methods. But whether you say do an immersion brew, which would be like a French press or cowboy coffee, or you do drip coffee, every brewing method has its own requirement for grind size to get optimal performance. So if you buy pre-ground coffee, you're buying coffee that was kind of ground to the Goldilocks profile of being just good enough for all these different things without being perfect for any of them. And the same thing happens if you're grinding coffee. So now you have to figure out, well, I really like to French press, or I really like to cold brew, or I really like drip coffees. So now you have to figure out what setting on your individual grinder gives you the right grind for that method of brewing coffee. I told you this got more complicated the further we went.
It's not very complicated. Just science.
Science! All right. Now, this picture on my left goes with the article I wrote, but this picture on the right is 3 different methods of brewing coffee that could all be considered like campfire coffee to me. From right to left, that's the campfire percolator, which is usually what I haul out if I have a group that I'm sharing coffee with. In the middle is my French press, which really makes about enough coffee for like me and one other person, because obviously my coffee requirements are a little greater than the average. And then on the far left is the nano presso that Mrs. Matterfax got me for Christmas. Because what else do you get a prepper coffee nerd husband for Christmas who's impossible to shop for? So here's the thing. Obviously, I like lots of different ways of brewing coffee. I have a regular old drip machine sitting here at the house. I have a couple of different coffee brewing methods that I take out on camping trips. The French press actually lives in my hiking pack because it's fairly small and lightweight, and I refuse to resort to instant coffee. I don't care if it takes up room in my bug out bag or my hiking pack. Dadgummit, I'm having real coffee every morning. That's just the way it's going to be. You gotta put your foot down somewhere and have priorities. We don't live like savages. But each one of those methods of making coffee comes with its own little proclivities, its own little requirements for grind size. I tend to just say to hell with it and go full blast dark roast every time. Although, if you want to get really deep into the rabbit hole, deeper than I am, there are those people that say that certain roast levels are actually better positioned for different types of brewing coffee. I don't know. I just know I like it dark and smoky, and that's just how I'm always going to roast my coffee. But that, in a nutshell, is how you turn green beans into drinkable coffee. You got to store it, roast it, grind it, brew it. And there's plenty more methods out there than what we've just illustrated, but I thought it'd be make for an interesting conversation, because if you're like us, then you're going to store this kind of stuff, because why the hell wouldn't you? And if you're going to store it and you don't know how to turn it into drinkable coffee, then what was the point of storing it in the first place?
Yeah, and like I said, this kind of goes back to preparedness. I mean, in a way that you're storing all kinds of other things, and if you like coffee, if you enjoy it at all, then store it. And so one of the best ways to store it is in its green form. So, the next best thing you could do is find a way to grow your own coffee, but that's a whole nother science. So, it's another rabbit hole, I really feel. But
it's a rabbit hole I've investigated a little bit, just enough to know that it's not feasible for me. The problems you run into, and there's somebody out there, I promise you, who's like, oh, that's no problem, I got that figured out. That's great. I can't do that. But the problems you run into with growing your own coffee is in anywhere in North America, it requires a greenhouse. Mm-hmm. Big surprise, with many things, our growing season, because of where we are away from the equator, our growing season is just not quite long enough for coffee. We get first frost way too early, and we get first hits of spring way too late in the growing season. So growing coffee like in your backyard up here in North America is probably a no-go. Has to be greenhouse. The other problem I'm finding is coffee tends to really favor and tends to fruit the most in higher altitude climates. And we do have altitude in North America, but the problem is most of the places you have altitude, you also have snow. So what you need for like the perfect environment for coffee is you need altitude and you need tropical conditions. And that is a fairly narrow band within the equatorial distance, the equatorial distance on the Earth. When you look at the places that coffee is really known for, Ethiopia, Colombia, Central America, you're looking at that region right there close to the equator, but you're looking at areas that also are known for having mountains. So you need those two things that just, I don't think they exist here in North America, where you get like 1,000 to 1,500 feet of elevation, and you get a very long growing season. And that's what's required for coffee. That's why I don't think growing coffee in North America can't be done. I think it's going to require a greenhouse on the side of a mountain. So, or maybe a fully like a hermetic climate controlled environment. But given the miracles of globalization, I don't think it's ever going to be economically viable to grow coffee in North America. I don't personally think so.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's, especially the greenhouse and stuff like that, I'm sure there's definitely ways to do it. But I mean, I don't know. It's interesting. But yeah, no, get your beans, mess around with them. It'd be fun to see. I mean, if you are listening to this and you decide to start it, it'd be fun to hear what people have done and their experiences with it. So,
yeah. And for the listeners that are out there listening to this, if any of y'all have any hobbies that are like, I call it prepper adjacent. It's not like prepping isn't a hobby. I've been very honest about that. But there are certain hobbies that kind of feed into the world of prepping. And if you're into any of those things, like, leave us a comment, and maybe we'll talk about it on our show, or maybe we'll drag your butt up out of the audience and force you to come on and tell us about it. Because it's always fun putting people on the spot.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I guess we'll go ahead and roll this one out. This has been the Coffee Nerd Rabbit Hole with Phil and Andrew in the Matter Effects podcast. And Andrew has work, and I have a honey-do list to get to.
Yep.
So, y'all have a good Sunday. Talk to y'all later, everybody.